And then the mushrooms started. Some days, all the racks were full. Morels. I'd look outside, there's 350 people lined up to sell their mushrooms, waiting for me to wake up. It was crazy.
How many pounds of fresh morels do you think you dried in total throughout the season?
Oh, well over 100,000 pounds.
So I'm sitting here with Randy, my father, who's a longtime wild harvester. And today he's going to tell you a story that happened in the mid-90s in the Yukon territory. So what was your experience with wild harvesting prior to this event?
I had started wild crafting, wild harvesting, wild foraging in the late 80s, 87, 88. Always had an interest in mushrooms. Many years before, I'd found huge volumes of morels and just give them all away, not knowing that they were valuable. But commercially started in the late 80s.
And that was with pine mushrooms?
Yeah, with pines.
When did you first harvest morels commercially?
I think it was 1990, but it may have been 89. I grabbed all my sons.
Not me.
Well, I don't think you were born yet. We all got in the vehicle, had a trailer stacked high, tied down with tarps, and off to a burn we went.
So the morel mushroom grows in abundance the year following a forest fire.
That's where we commercially target them, yes.
Yeah.
They do grow in the natural environment, but it's hard to get volumes that you need to do this for a living.
So you started harvesting morels in 1990. What brought you to the north of Canada all the way to the Yukon?
I had always wanted to go to the Yukon because I grew up in a gold mining town in northern Ontario, Dawson City, a gold mining, gold rush, the whole story of adventure. And it was Sean Ryan, who's a well-known prospector in the Yukon. He was from northern Ontario, close to where I was from. We ran into each other in northern BC, picking pine mushrooms, and we would camp together, help each other. And he was just starting out. He found a lot of mushroom patches because he applied science to how he does everything. So he would do the fall mushrooms, and it would help him finance his explorations in the Yukon.
Well, when I first met Sean Ryan about 10 years ago, he explained to me that part of his success in prospecting was through following similar patterns that he learned from picking mushrooms, which I found very interesting.
Exactly, and it's the same process. You have certain data that you're looking for, and then when you find that data, you explore further.
So when did this story take place?
It was in cooperation with the Selkirk First Nation, the Northern Tuchoni of Pelly Crossing, Yukon. So we organized, implemented a first of its kind, really, of that form of federal territory, community, all the Harvester Association. That had never happened before that I know of on that scale. It was a lot of things had to be done properly according to government regulations.
So this was the first large-scale government and community organized mushroom harvest of its kind. Right. So for this to happen in the Yukon of northern Canada, of all places, is quite outstanding to me.
Well, it was, and I liked how they did it because they didn't tell people you can do that and you can't. It was none of that. Because Minto of the geography, it's a nice flat area, sandy. So there was already established campgrounds there.
Why did they choose you to be the dryer? At this point, you'd had 4 years of harvesting morels commercially in the Yukon. Was that the reason?
That was part of the reason, because I had already had established connections with people in the Yukon over the last 4 or 5 years. But also the fact that we were there early. There was nobody else around that they could have hired to do. When Dawson City, and I love Dawson, I recommend everybody put that on their bucket list, give you a real feel for the old Wild West and the Gold Rush days. Anyways, that's where we'd go to, get our laundry done, get water. In that process of going there and getting a room for the night, I became friends with the people that owned the Midnight Sun Hotel. The chief from Pelly was in the bar there and talking to the owner. He said that, they needed to find somebody, and so she recommended me.
Well, what was your drying setup like in those days?
That year was all wood. We had fans, but we just used those for the final process.
At that time, in the early season, when you first went up to the Yukon in 1995, how many harvesters were doing this commercially in those days?
Hardly a handful of people knew about the Yukon having morels.
So you were some of the first pickers there in the early season before the big commercial operation began. You've connected with the First Nation of the Northern Tachone at the time, and you've worked with the government and the First Nation to do basically a large-scale commercial wild morel project. Then what? What materials did you need? Did you need drying racks? Can you explain to me all the different stuff you needed?
Right, well, first we had to figure out what we needed. So there was a process of, okay, we need to build this, we need to build that. So we'd start all those things being built.
So you're really pioneering this,
Right.
the industry at the time.
We made a box with racks that went inside, and it sat over the bottom part would be metal roofing. Then we dug a bit of a hole in the ground with a venting that we would put a squirrel fan on the outside, and it would blow hot air from the bottom of the stove up through this vertical box, and we had racks in there. So that's how we would finish them. We only do that stage once they're like 80% dry. It's part of the finishing and flashing. Everything else we just air dried. We had 3 big structures that had a roof and posts, but no walls. Everything's open. So we filled all that in with plastic, put a wood stove in there, built racks in there. We start get backlogged pretty quickly, and it's like we ended up making over 700 3x7 racks. When they were all together, it was like a field of racks. The banks of the Yukon, the river erodes deeper, so it's this big steep bank, and then up on top it's all a big flat landing, like with the airport and big giant area. It's all nice and flat, so it was good where we camped there, right? You got this grassy flat land on the top, and you're overlooking this river scene, and then you got the forest, the boreal forest across the way across the river. The river's wide there. It's like maybe a kilometer across.
Wow. Yeah, the Yukon River is quite
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. So we started making what we needed, and then we said, well, now we need pickers, and so we said the best place is the First Nations community, and so we did a seminar, and I taught them all how to use the buckets, put holes in the buckets, carry the mushrooms safely, the whole thing with the pack boards and the baskets, how I do it, how to cut them and how to pick them. We got quite a few people that went out and worked on the land that year from Pelly Crossing. So that was really nice. Got a lot of people involved.
This is also all being partially funded and approved by the government, and so that you're also working with the government officially.
To the government, credit, it was done in a way to implement safety and do things right, and they funded it. The only thing we can control is where they can camp. But other than that, everybody just carried on as normal.
For people who don't know, basically the order of operation is that harvesters like ourselves will go out into these wilderness areas on these wildfires, and they'll pick the mushrooms and either quad them out or walk them out of the bush and bring them to a buying station, which is basically like a little depot that's set up where somebody like Randy can weigh the mushrooms and grade them and pay the harvesters, and then once that's done, they all get brought to his large drying operation that he's doing with the First Nation. So the harvesters would bring their mushrooms at the buying station. What was that experience like?
Well, in the beginning of the year, it's slower because they're just starting. People are only finding a few, but it builds pretty quickly to where you're overwhelmed and you got more mushrooms than you can deal with. At that time, there was no other buyers that showed up to buy. Nobody else but us where people could sell their mushrooms. Everybody that picked mushrooms, I got to talk to and see and relate with.
It becomes a very communal experience.
They're awesome people, and I was giving them money.
Yeah.
They're hard work.
Yeah, and it's honest hard work. It's very sustainable work, very engaging for anybody who likes to work in nature.
Yeah, and then the mushrooms started, and mushrooms became everything. I was literally working 48-hour shifts and then dropping, literally just exhausted, drop. They supplied a trailer for me to live in. So I would just go and I'd just like flop down. I don't even remember falling asleep, be instantly asleep. Waking up 3 hours later hearing people outside, and I'm like, what the heck? And I'd look outside, there's 350 people lined up to sell their mushrooms, waiting for me to wake up. It was crazy. I felt responsible. All these people go out and work hard all day, and if I don't buy their mushrooms, then they're relying on me, and I take that seriously, right? So one day we had a wind event. It hit the other end of the camps. It was like Quonsets up in the trees, and tents blowing over and into the trees, and a wall tent turned over and rolled over and over with all the logs and everything. Oh my God, people are running over there to help out, and then all of a sudden I see one start, and it looks like a pencil line, very thin, and it goes up hundreds of feet into the air. And I watched it was coming right at us, and I quickly jumped in the truck and I drove it in. We had this one big A-frame right on the banks of the river, and I drove the truck, parked it in front, grabbed a couple pieces of plywood, and I just got them screwed on the front of it when that wind hit. But I didn't have time. I had all these racks of mushrooms spread out in the sun, drying. Bloody little twister went right through those mushrooms. There was like racks. Didn't pick all the racks, but just some of them for some reason. And they were kind of like 8-10 feet, just kind of, doing this in the air, going a bit around. But it's all these mushrooms. It was like something off some stupid movie. And then all of a sudden it stopped. Those few racks dropped back down on the other racks, and all the mushrooms fell down, many of them onto racks again. But it was a mess, and we had to clean it all up. But the A-frame totally survived perfectly. I got that on there just in time. But then every day is like compounded, and there's more and more. But, it was building, and then we kind of hit. There was a couple of pickers that showed up, but mostly it was the locals from Pelly that were bringing in. But then it wasn't enough. We knew if we didn't get more volume, it wasn't going to be viable. So I went to Dawson, and I started going around all the bars and recruiting pickers. We ended up with close to 500 pickers. I was totally, I was just focused on getting them dry. However I could, every little angle, every little thing I could do, I was doing.
So you went all the way to Dawson. You've recruited all these pickers. They've all come back to Minto near Pelly Crossing, and they're all camping there.
Yep.
And you've got all these people ready to harvest.
Right, and we had prepared for a lot of pickers. So we had put in 18 two-code outhouses with a backhoe and everything. We started a restaurant, we had water, we had showers, wash machines, all these things we supplied, and all to code with the health department. Everything kind of had its own protocol, right?
So now you're in this position where you have 500 harvesters.
Yep.
You have all the facilities to code.
Yep.
You've got 700 drying racks and all these dryers.
Yeah.
And the mushrooms are starting to be at peak flush.
Yeah.
How was the volume?
It got so overwhelming. Some days, all the racks were full. We had 500 overloaded racks. We had a big tarp with a foot of mushrooms all covering it.
How many pounds of mushrooms can you fit on a rack of that size?
Normally, as you know, we put like 2 baskets on a 5x3.
Which is about 20 to 25 pounds.
Yeah, but then we were making the 3x7 racks. That's how it's gone in my life. Started out with 3x7. Right. I went to 3x5. Yeah. Now I'm
3 by 2.5 now. Easier to carry as you get older.
Oh, absolutely.
So now we're peak season. You've got 500 to 700 racks that are loaded up to 25 pounds each.
Yeah.
So that's over 10,000 pounds a day at this point in the season.
With very poor drying, because that was at the stage of the industry where we were all trying to figure it out.
Right. How long did that peak season last for?
That was a year that the naturals went on quite a while. They was like an extended natural season. I would say we probably did 70,000 pounds of naturals alone.
So on the burns, there's sort of 2 stages of mushroom growth. At this time, the science had not separated the early burn species from the naturally growing species. So they were often referred to as naturals commercially. That was one of the original common names. They grow first, and then later on, there's a whole nother flush of different species that comes separated usually at the end of the season. So you've had 70,000 or so pounds of the early morels.
Yep.
And then the late stage fire morels started coming in.
Right, and then we quit buying the naturals, the first run, because they started getting wormy, so we quit buying those. There was a bit of a lull, maybe 3 or 4 days, We had some good rains and then warm and sunny after between. We ended up with around 700 racks, maybe 748 comes into my mind, but it's a while ago. We had all these guys making the racks, and when you cut the hardware cloth, you want to cut it a little short so that it doesn't, the ends when you cut it, they stick out into these little knives and needles that stick out and they slice and poke you. They weren't very careful, and there were so many of the screens, and you're under the gun, man. You got all these morels, a lot of poundage, so a lot of pressure. You know, the buyers and the dryers do a lot for the companies. They really do. If they mess up, it's catastrophic.
Yeah. I've been there with you on some of these large drying operations, and it is a lot of responsibility. And the security, I mean, it's a lot of value coming through in an open space in the bush. You know, if you make a mistake, it can be very costly. On the other hand, if you do a good job and you get a good dry ratio, you can make the company a lot more money.
I don't like to wear gloves, but it got to the point where I had to in the end because I get poked and cut. So my hands, when I'd wake up in the morning, I couldn't move them. They're all festered, and I got like literally 500 pokes, punctures, and slices. You can see there, that's where what the hardware cloth is sliced.
Hey, why are you still cutting your hands on those racks 30 years later?
Because people still don't listen when I say cut the screens.
Wasn't me.
Stupidity has no age.
Well, I'd say maybe it's my age. So at this point, you have a crew of people you've trained to help you on the drying setup.
Right, I had 2 crews. I had the buyers and graders. So I had 3 tables. So when you come up to the front of the line, there was 3 kiosks you could go to. Most of the time, all 3 were busy. They got us a couple of ATVs. We had a skidoo trailer. So we would put all the stuff in there, take them away on the skidoo trailer with the ATV, get spread out onto racks. Try to get them onto racks right away. By then, you were ready to go back and get another load. Because it's the Yukon, there's only 3-4 hours where people aren't trying to sell mushrooms.
At that time of year in the Yukon, it doesn't really get dark. You could see for 24 hours a day, but there's sort of a short period of dusk.
Yeah, no, I don't get any overtime either.
Okay, so you've had this trained crew that can sort of watch your drying setup. When that first fire at Minto started to slow down, what did you do next?
There was 3 large fires over 60,000 hectares each. We ended up later in the year, we did an ATV 80 kilometers up the Pelly River and then behind Prospector Mountain. They had fallen 2 trees across the river, one from one side and one from the other side. So they overlapped like this, and they put nailed plywood on it. And you went across that plywood. Where the 2 crossed like that, you had to move the ATV. It's like a 30-point turn.
I've been taken out with the Nutchinag Dun First Nation in the Yukon ATVing before. And,
Doing crazy.
And that was quite an experience. Those guys, they're pretty comfortable on those off-road vehicles for sure.
Yeah.
So now you're scouting these other burns in the area that aren't being harvested as much, to try to extend the mushroom flush. And did you find any good areas?
So yeah, anyway, so we went way back into Big Adventure, back to the back corner of that burn, and we later flew into that lake, Rockfish Lake. We flew in by float plane and ended up taking quite a few mushrooms out of there. We picked all those baskets in an hour.
Wow.
Like they were all big and beautiful, and there was
nobody picked there then.
Well, no, yeah.
What was the general community consensus from the Northern Tachone First Nation members and all the other locals in that region of the Yukon that were involved in this? What did they think of all of it?
I think at some point everybody in the community benefited financially. Pretty positive all around. There was a lot of benefit. One day we decided we were going to clean all the dried mushrooms. I made big cages out of the hardware cloth, and they'd pour them all in there, and they had big fans, and they'd bounce them around in there, blowing any debris off. Wow. Everybody in the whole town was working that day. Like 2 or 3 days of it.
It was quite a substantial season because it was one of the first organized commercial seasons.
Right.
Did it bring in a lot of new harvesters into wild harvesting morels?
Oh yeah, for sure. That was like a major exposure, and like some of them made really good money.
I met somebody in the middle of the nowhere in the Yukon up near Keno, which is a small silver mining community, 3 years ago when I was working up there with one of the First Nations actually. And he was an old time picker. I think his name was Jurg. He's an older time picker, and he was a really nice guy. And somehow it came up to where we started talking about you. We're both mushroom enthusiasts. And we started talking about you. He brought it up. He said, "Oh, do you know somebody named Randy Marchand?" And I said, "Yeah, he's my dad." And he started getting all excited and gave me a hug, called his wife over. We started chatting, and he said, "Yeah, Randy sort of kicked off my interest in wild harvesting at the Minto year." He started referencing some of the, his memories of this huge drying operation from that year in the Yukon, and how that's had a long-lasting effect on him.
Well, you've been around when I've done other large drying. You know how busy you are. It's just it's like you're an anthill, right? And everybody's got to be doing their thing, and but then I got to oversee and make sure there's no slowdowns in the chain. It was a wonderful example of what government, community, and an industry can do when you have the will to work together. Instead of just regulating and forcing everybody to do everything, you help create a system that works for everybody.
That's something that I've noticed with the wild mushroom industry is, apart from the few bad apples that you get in any industry, apart from that, it's a very communal experience, and it's like you're all out there working in this wilderness, working really, really hard, and it's honorable, sustainable work, and you're exhausted, but you all have this joint focus on harvesting these mushrooms and the success of that and the camaraderie that goes along with it. So it's really a great part about this industry. How many pounds of fresh morels do you think you dried in total throughout the season?
Oh, well over 100,000 pounds.
Wow, it's unbelievable at that stage. This is in 1995.
With very primitive drying skills. Like the whole industry didn't have a grip on what to totally do.
It's still evolving even today. I mean, we're still building dryers and tweaking things and learning things every year, even to this day.
Pat Van Bibber was the chief, and he's a really good guy. A pleasure to work with him. Working with him in meetings and planning, all of it is like he was very helpful, and that was pretty well past the point of exhaustion, but I'm just going and going and going and going. And then one day I said, I need to take a day off. So my buddy Wayne had his float plane, and so he says, I'll fly you up to Dawson right now, and I'll come and pick you up at noon tomorrow. So he flew me to Dawson City. I got out of the plane, he flew away. I went and got a hotel room at the Midnight Sun, had a shower and sheets on a bed, food in a restaurant. We went for another week and a half, 2 weeks after that. But it was like winding down, starting to take some things apart. And we got to the point where most of our product was from the fly-ins, so it was way more controlled.
Well, thanks for sharing this story. I hope everybody enjoyed this, and if you did, there is a wealth of stories like this that I've been told from my father Randy, and from some of the other old veterans in the industry. So if you want to hear more stories like this, let us know in the comments below, and I would be happy to document some of these stories. There's some pretty crazy ones hiding out there in the woods with these people. So let us know in the comments, and see you next time.
Yukon, Canada, eh?